Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Dru Freeman and Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 13 for season 9, our last episode for this season. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 24th of September, for broadcast on the 2nd of October 2019. This episode and season are sponsored by Triple Byte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. I'm Dru Freeman, here with my soon-to-be departing season 9 co-host, Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Dru. Joining us on this episode is Antonio Leiva. Antonio helps Android developers boost their career and grow their personal branding. Mentor and Kotlin trainer certified by JetBrains, writer of the book Kotlin for Android developers. He also does online courses and live training for companies. You can find more at antonioleiva.com.
In this episode, Antonio will discuss clean architecture. In part 2, Jenn will talk about actions for the Google Assistant and app actions. And finally, we'll wrap up the season with a retrospect and a final goodbye to Ms. Bailey. Antonio, welcome to the show.
Welcome, and thank you so much for having me today here.
I am so thrilled to have you here. Antonio is also one of the featured engineers in the Ray Wenderlich book, Living by the Code, which I had the privilege of reading your section. And having struck out this year on my own to start my own business, or at least to try to live off my own business, I really appreciated a lot of what you said in that chapter. And I think maybe we will focus on that in a future episode, but I'm so thrilled to have another person who's decided to eschew the corporate world for their own corporate desires.
Yeah, it's always a very interesting journey. It's kind of scary at the beginning, but it pays well off always. I am really happy to have done it.
Lots of personal training and personal enrichment and personal terror along the way.
Indeed. Yeah, that's what happens. What goes around in your head when you are going through your own business. All the new things that you have to learn that don't have to be anything related to programming or to developing. You have to develop a lot of new skills that are even way more difficult than that programming itself. So it's very, very fun, but also very challenging.
Not to focus too completely on that, because like I said, we'll probably focus on this on a later show. But one of the things I really appreciated was you saying that you figured out what kind of tasks you would have from month to month based on what kind of income you knew you were likely to get in for the month. So once you knew what your input and income was going to be, that helped you guide and steer what you would do in further for the quarter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's more or less what I try to do, and also always have something that allows me to know beforehand what's going to happen, not to be run out of cash at any moment. Have some things that are recurring enough to be able to live out for the following months without worrying if you are trying a new thing that could not go well or this kind of things. I always try to balance that so that it's not so scary.
I think that you are very brave. So reading your story, you really dove into a new thing when you adopted Kotlin. And I loved reading your story. It just made me think, wow, Antonio's a really brave individual. That's someone cool to look up to.
Thank you.
Go all in on a new technology, and that's a scary thing to do, in my opinion.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, it was not so difficult because I at the beginning did both things at the same time. I was working for a company, and at the same time starting building my business, just in case it didn't go well. So the things that I tried, if they didn't come out well, it wouldn't be such a problem because I had the backup of a regular job. But But in the end, when I saw that it was stable enough to go for it, I decided to move on. And yeah, I've been that for 1 year already. In fact, I think today I'm doing exactly 1 year since I moved to start with my own project.
Mhm. And it is daunting to be an early adopter in any technology. You being an early adopter into Kotlin, I was very fortunate when I took one of the jobs I had. They actually hired me on to be an early adopter of a technology and to help that company transition into that technology. And it's wonderful to be given those beneficial opportunities. But
And
we are here to talk about clean architecture. So
yeah.
can you give me an initial definition of how of your definition of clean architecture?
Yeah, I will start first with the definition of an architecture in general. And an architecture is a way of structuring your code so that it can evolve easily in the future, so that the new things that we need to add to our code, or even the changes that we receive from our clients, don't affect so much to our base code that we need to rewrite anything, or that we need a lot of time to adapt our current code to the new needs. So the architecture is partly that, the way we structure our base code in our projects, but it also generates a language in your team, because that way your team has a set of ideas and of concepts that they can talk about without having to decide every time how they are going to tackle a new feature or a new part of the project. And that's very helpful, because it saves a lot of time and a lot of misunderstandings in the team when you have something that everyone can follow and adapt to when they are creating new code. So that will be a very generic definition of an architecture. And in particular, the clean architecture is just a solution that was created by Robert C. Martin, or Uncle Bob, that is yeah, that we all know about him. And what he created is a specific solution of an architecture that, based on his experience, he thought that it was the best solution to an architecture in any software, in any app or software that we want to develop. And it's just a specific form of a layered architecture. A layered architecture is just an architecture that is divided into layers, and we have a set of components that are put in those different layers, and then we decide the interactions that we can have between those layers.
Okay, so you're basically saying that the clean architecture starts by putting things into a series of layers.
Yeah, and this is a good thing, because that way you can separate those layers in a way that some of those layers the changes of some of those layers don't affect to other layers. So you can protect parts of your code from the changes of these other layers. And why this is good? Because imagine that we are working with a library, a third-party library that we decided that it was good for us, and this library is used in all the parts of our code in many different classes and many different modules. At some point we need to change it for something, because there's a new need that the library doesn't cover, or there's a new library that is better for a better solution for that particular problem. if we have those libraries separated in a layer that can be easily modified without affecting the rest of our code, it's very easy to move to the new one. On the other hand, if we have everything spread all around our code, the pain of changing that can be huge. So
I think we've all had the situations, or I think many of us have had that situation where we've depended on that third-party library, and all of a sudden we've had to rip it out and replace it with something else. And the more you've had that abstraction layer where you've been able to say, okay, so there's a shim between the library's APIs and my app's calls, that definitely gives that ripping out and putting back in again a lot easier of an experience. But you have to have a really good and strong abstraction to have that layering process work.
Is one of the goals here like to decouple? Is decoupling the right term, to separate those layers?
Yeah, I think it's one of the major benefits, because the clean architecture is not only that, it's divided into several layers, not only our domain layer or our app layer and the third-party libraries layer, but you also have other mid layers that help you organize your code in a much easier way that then, as we mentioned at the beginning, developers can use to first debate about the different solutions that they can give to a problem, and second, when you as a member of the team have to read something that you didn't wrote, or change something in a feature that you were not involved, is much easier to understand if that feature was written using the same architecture that you used in the rest of the features, because the components will be in the same place in the same layer. Also, the names of the classes usually follow a similar pattern, so it's easier to understand that if you are using a data source, you know what it is, or if you are using a repository, you also know what it is. So all this language speeds up the development and also the communication between the members of the team.
All right, so we've talked about having the different layers, as you've talked about library layers, domain layers, app layers. We've also talked about naming conventions, keeping naming conventions similar between the different layers. Are there any other layers that I'm missing other than, say, the domain layer, the app layer, the library layer? Can you give us a few others that we may find there?
This is very personal, because the clean architecture doesn't force you to use any specific layers. It's more like a set of rules rather than an exact implementation.
Exactly.
But in my case, I tend to have the domain layer, which is the place where we put all the business logic of our app. Everything that I think about that layer, I think that about something that would apply to my app, to the iOS app, to a web app, even to the backend, because it's something that it's like the rules that our business follow. So that's the part of the code that I would add to that domain layer. And once we have that domain layer, we would move to the use cases layer, which is the interactions that the user can do with our application. Every time a user press a button, that can be converted into a use case that is just an action that our code can do, and that action then will trigger some effects into our code. And this is what is usually also called the application layer, because it's something that is more specific to our app. Maybe the mobile app has a button that the web app doesn't, and doesn't make sense to use all the same use cases in all the products of our project. So this would be like the second level in our core code, the basic code of our code. And then you could have the next one that would be the data layer. That would be the how we communicate with the outside world, from where we are receiving the information and where we are sending the changes of that data to the outside world again. So the data layer is usually like the abstraction between our code and the outside world.
So a communications layer as well. I'm glad you mentioned the term that the clean architecture is not so much the layers as it is a series of rules, because I mean, every piece of code is going to have its own specific needs, its own specific care and feeding. Can you talk about some of the rules that help with clean architecture that aren't necessarily the layering of the code?
Yeah, one of the most important rules is that the inner layers cannot know anything of the outer layers. So this is a bit counterintuitive, because if we imagine when we are pressing a button on our UI, then as we mentioned, we would call the use case. The use case would use the model of or the domain of our app, and then we have to go backwards in the layers. The data layer and the libraries layer or the framework layer or whatever you want to call it would be outside the layers that need to use it. So this is a bit counterintuitive, because how can I use an outer layer if I cannot know anything about it? And here is when a very important concept comes in, which is the dependency inversion principle, which is one of the solid principles that you may have heard about. And the dependency inversion principle, which means is that we, instead of interacting with concrete classes, what we do is to work with abstractions. In practical terms, it would be an interface. Instead of using the specific definition of the class, we use an interface and we communicate with that. The interface will be defined in our inner class, and then the external classes would use that interface and implement it to the specific case. And this is very easy to understand with the libraries examples that we told before. If we want to abstract from a library, we can have an interface of what we need as an internal class, as an internal layer. We have an interface with a set of methods that the external layer needs to give a concrete implementation for that. So if we have the library that we want to use, we would use it in this class that we implement the interface, and that way we don't need to know everything about the outer layers, because it's the outer layers the one in charge of creating this concrete implementation of our interface.
And there's so many good UI design patterns that have taught us how to separate the model from the view. So you've got a model that basically handles your business logic, handles your business computations, but doesn't necessarily know when a button is being pressed, or doesn't necessarily know when a communication asynchronously finishes. It simply is able to respond to its own state that it's notified. And it's become the core fundamentals of a lot of your design. And now you're moving from that MVC world and the MVVM world into a more reactive world, which everybody's been talking about this season. And we could go into all of that through several different paradigms, but yeah, having those abstraction layers so that level A doesn't necessarily need to know what level D is doing has really helped focus in on keeping that code clean. And that's what we're talking about, is clean architecture.
Yeah, that's it. And yeah, I think that's the main point of the clean architecture. I know that, or architectures in general, I know that there are many people a little scared of the complexity that it brings. But what I always try to express and to say is that we don't need to go so farther. We just need to detect what are the layers that we need in our application, depending on the complexity of the app, the how long is going to evolve, because if we are doing an app that is going to take 1 month, for instance, and then we forget forever, it doesn't make sense to build very complex architecture for that. So in the end, it depends a lot on the case that we are building, so to decide one more complex solution or a simpler one.
Now, when you're dealing with clean architecture, you're dealing with this layered approach of having abstraction between the layers so they don't know what each other is doing. Do you find that you're layering your tests in as a layer by itself? You have a testing layer, or do you have the tests in each of the other layers? Do you have an abstracted communication layer set of tests? Do you have a view set of tests? How do you find that works best for you?
I have both kind of tests. I have tests that only affect one layer, and that way I can test that module independently. And then if I want to, this is what I usually call the unit test. And if I want to test that two layers work well together, which is usually called integration test, I can have the tests that go through several layers and then depending on the complexity or depending on the exact thing that I want to test, I may go from all the layers or set a point where I mock something or fake something. For instance, if I'm going to do a request to a server, that usually doesn't make much sense on a test. So you can put something there that behaves as a server, and from that point, the test would be mocked. But yeah, I have these two kind of tests usually on my base code.
And since it's the architecture that we're talking about and not the actual code design itself, I would assume then that test-driven development would even work in this environment as long as you're being careful as to keeping your code abstracted as you develop it.
Yeah, I think in fact that test-driven development helps a lot in building a good architecture from scratch, because it forces you to think about things that you wouldn't if you are just writing the code and then writing the test about it. So it's a very interesting approach when you are working with architectures.
Could you describe how would you use clean architecture on a very simple scenario? Like, let's use a classic, like a to-do list. How could you use clean architecture without it being over complicated?
The minimum that I would use for a clean architecture would be to have these classes that we mentioned, the domain, that, for instance, there we would have the nodes class, the model of our app, and then the use cases layer that would be that when we put we press the button to add a layer, it would run to add a node, it would run the add action. When we click on one, it would run the navigate, the delete. All these actions would be there as models, as use cases. And then I would have a data layer that would get that would communicate with the place where we are saving these nodes. For instance, if we are using a database, I would model a data. I would use a data source that would define how I want to communicate with the database, and then in the framework layer, we could call it, or the libraries layer, we would have the Run library, for instance, or the library that we want to use as a library, and an implementation of that interface that we specified in the data layer. So it would be, in fact, this case would be quite simple once you understand, because I think that the most difficult part in clean architectures is to understand the dependency inversion. But once you have understood that, everything makes sense, and it's easier to understand. So it would be a very simple case in that situation.
Great, thank you.
Have you noticed that Kotlin has lent itself better for clean architecture than, say, Java? Or have you, or are the code bases far enough removed from architecture that it doesn't really matter?
I don't think that it affects a lot in the sense of the language itself, but as Kotlin provides new tools that are a bit more simple that the ones that we had in Java, it's inevitable that it becomes a little easier. But not because we do things differently, but because when we write the same things, the code, it's inherently simpler. So in the end, it becomes simpler, but the ideas and the modules that you use in general are exactly the same.
So the tools have made it easier to approach clean architecture, but the code, the code languages themselves are only more difficult just because of the older tools. Now the newer tools are making it easier.
Yeah. And for instance, with coroutines that I know that you mentioned in a previous episode, everything becomes easier too. And yeah, we are, thanks to Kotlin, we are moving to a much simpler and cleaner code, just because of the many tools that we have and the new features of the language.
Could you take us through, like, what is the dependency inversion principle for someone who's new to the solid principles?
Okay, so let's imagine that we have a module, a class in our code that is using, let's say, a database. And inside that class, we create a new instance of that database. Let's say it's a room database. We create a new room instance inside that class. The problem with that is that, for instance, if we want to test that, we cannot do it because the dependency is being created inside the class. So we have no way to modify that dependency in any ways. And for the reader, they don't know that we have this dependency inside this class unless they get into the code and start reading the code. But the API of the class, to say it in a way, doesn't inform us that this module has a dependency to another module. How can we solve that? The way to do that is to extract that dependency from that class and let another part of our code to implement that, to provide that dependency for us. So instead of creating the new dependency inside of our code, we move it, for instance, to the constructor, and we are not doing the new of this object inside of our class. So now the dependency is more clear, and also we can modify that dependency in tests. For instance, if we want to change it for a mock or for a testing object. So this is what we call inversion of control, not dependency inversion, which are very similar but are not exactly the same. The extraction of the dependency from our class. If we want to do inversion of control, we would change those specific, if we want to do dependency inversion, what we need to do is to change these specific implementations for an interface that we don't need to know anything about. For instance, instead of sending to the component a room database, we would have a database interface that has a method that, for instance, is save or update or delete, this kind of methods that we would use on a database, but we don't know what's the specific implementation of that. So with that, we have abstracted ourselves to the specific implementation, and that's what we would call dependency inversion. And this is what allows us, what we mentioned at the beginning, we prevent us from the need of knowing the external layers and in a way be able to use them.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful.
That makes sense.
Thank you. All of the work that you do, I remember you talking in the interview about having an ability when you work for yourself of managing your work and life balance. And I know you said you have a recent child, a very young one. How old now?
14 months.
Is this your first?
Yeah, it's our first.
Are you getting any sleep yet?
Yeah, in fact, she sleeps a lot, but the rest of the day, she doesn't stop.
So I take it that outside of coding and doing the work for the business, your primary focus right now is I have a 14-month-old.
Yeah.
Do you have time for anything else, or is that pretty much all the focus now?
No, right now it's everything. My business and my family, I don't have time for much more, honestly, right now.
Yeah, but the family is what keeps you sane and keeps you going.
Yeah, that's it. That's the meaning of everything.
All of this adds up to what really becomes core for maintaining a good code base. This is a way to not merely keep your code organized and keep it from becoming a tangled mess of spaghetti code, but at the same time makes it easier to maintain over time as you have to evolve it. And I think this is all some really good material, Antonio. I want to thank you for all this information, and I think it's going to help a lot of our listeners if they're not already doing this themselves.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
In the second half, Jen is going to be talking to us about the Google Assistant and some actions for Google Assistant, as well as talking about app actions in general. And we'll talk about some of that in the second part of our show coming up after this word from TripleByte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. We'll be back in a few. This RayWenderlich.com podcast is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on phone screens, take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your interest or your cover letters. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help.
They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you get to go straight to the final interviews with the companies on their platform. It's like the common app for software engineers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code.
And I can appreciate that. Being in the industry for 35 years, I'm entirely self-taught. My undergraduate study was in theater, and I left school to do my first job, so I don't carry a bachelor's, no bachelor's of arts, no bachelor's of science, and that's the one thing I'm often trying to hide or misdirect on my resume. With TripleByte, they'd care more about the coding experience that I have and not worry about that one little fact.
Apply now at triplebyte.com/Ray. That's triplebyte.com, byte, B-Y-T-E, as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
And again, a special thanks to TripleByte, that's Byte B-Y-T-E, for sponsoring this episode and this season of the Ray Wenderlich podcast. We're back for section 2, And Jen has been working with the Google Assistant. She really enjoyed Google I/O this year and all of the information dump that she got. And we're going to have Jen talk about some of that information that she picked up at Google I/O. Jen, tell us about the Google Assistant.
Great, thanks, Dru. I love the Google Assistant. So this was a technology that I love to see emerging. I was a big fan of Google Now, and this is kind of filling that space over the last couple of years. Last year through GDG, there was a DevFest campaign, so I got to put on a DevFest for making actions for the assistant. And if you published an action, you could get a t-shirt. So I missed the deadline for my t-shirt, but a lot of the people who participated in my DevFest, or a couple people, got their t-shirt.
Maybe if we're lucky, somebody who's associated with GDG will hear this podcast and they'll take great solace upon you, and you may yet still sneak a t-shirt from somebody who's able to get you one, or maybe one of our listeners will go, oh, she needs one. So tell me, what is a Google Assistant action?
Great. So a Google Assistant action is like a skill to Alexa. So it's something that the Google Assistant can do. So it's basically your app for the Google Assistant. Mm-hmm. And the Google Assistant's currently on over 1 billion devices. So this just keeps growing and growing. And one of the fun projects we did is there's an Assistant SDK to put it for like hardware manufacturers and stuff. And you can build, they have a cardboard AIY kit. So if you have a Raspberry Pi, you can turn that into a cardboard version of a home, of a Google Home. So there's just endless possibilities. They make it easy to build Assistant into new devices, hoping that it'll get adopted more with like smart home and those sorts of things. So
is there a template to make an action?
There are. So there's a lot of different ways that you can make a Google Assistant. So in the simplest terms, an action defines support for a user request. So the user makes a request, and like in the case of a conversational action, you have a tool called Dialogflow that'll do your natural language processing. So it'll take the user's request and parse it down into pieces for you. And then the programmer writes the fulfillment. So you can write the fulfillment and that returns it. So there's different ways to interact with the assistant and build actions. One of the cool ways that they presented at I/O this year is you can enhance web content. And this will increase the discoverability through the search and the assistant. So you do that by adding structured data to your web content. So that's mainly for web developers. And as you'd ask, there's templates for that. And so you can build using their templates an FAQ, like a frequently asked questions section for your site. You could build a how-to tutorial. We could launch this podcast through one of those. So you could use the assistant to look up a podcast. And many of us use the recipes. So I know when the Google Homes were new, that was something a lot of the users were excited about, that you could say, you know, how do I make this certain recipe? And it'll walk you through step by step. And that is really cool. And then also for news. So that's for web content. If you want to build an action more like a conversational action with the templates, they have a flashcard template, again, another how-to guide, and there is a quiz and also trivia. So one of my DevFest participants got a t-shirt using the templates, which was really cool because they made a very high quality quiz. And that is such a neat way to get started or to bring attention to your app or your website. And it makes the assistant more entertaining. So the more of these actions that are out there, the more fun the assistant can be.
And how, so I can ask whenever I want.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, you can go ahead.
And how does that work? I mean, when you say something to the phone, the Google Assistant divides that sentence into parts, I guess, and you get them in the action in how's the structure of the data that you receive in that action?
Great. So there are entities, and those represent the type of the parameters in the request. So if we were working with recipes and say we wanted to make soup, say I want to make potato leek soup, you could have entities that are vegetables, and you can, an entity is cool because you can make a list of different values that it could match with that entity. So like spinach and broccoli, and you could list a bunch of different vegetables, and it will do that matching for you. It'll recognize those words and be able to pull them out as parameters and tell you what type of parameters that there are. So that makes it much easier to identify the important parts of the request, because that way they can word the request in many different ways, but it will identify and type the different things in the request.
So this basically is now the third player in the virtual assistant universe. You've got Alexa over on the Amazon side, you've got Siri over on the iOS and Apple Mac side, and now you also have Google Assistant to take those virtual requests and turn them into actions.
Yes. And don't forget Bixby, because Samsung has an assistant too. So, but a lot of times I've talked to iPhone users who are also Android developers, so maybe a little biased, but they mostly use Siri to invoke the Google Assistant. So you can the Google Assistant on iPhone if you want to, because you can install the Google Assistant app on your iPhone, and you can tell Siri to start the Google Assistant app.
Does Google Assistant have a free, is that the Hey Google, or?
Yes. And as you notice, that one thing that is hilarious, and I've seen it in many presentations, if you don't turn off your, turn off your phone, unplug, I have an assistant right by my bed, Google Home. So I have unplugged it, because you will say, okay, Google, during your presentation. While I was watching talks to prepare for this presentation, things are chiming everywhere because they say, okay, Google on the TV. So you can't
and this has been my biggest concern about having the assistants of any of the flavors in my home turned on, because I'm just afraid somebody's going to walk into my house and go, hey, Alexa, order a case of Dom Perignon. And the next thing I know, all of a sudden I've got this $6,000 bill on my credit card because some idiot came in my house and said, hey, I can talk to this thing.
Now, I hope that you would be safe from that happening, because one of the things with actions is there's intents, and you can do custom intents or built-in intents. So an intent is like what the user's trying to do with your action. So order a case of Dom Perignon would be a good
come back. Request. Are you sure you want to do this?
Yeah, first off, it should recognize that it's not your voice. And then in order to do like transactions, you should have to enable the transactions and have given permission.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Does Google Assistant do vocal recognition so it recognizes multiple users?
It does, and that is really awesome because my daughter and I both use it. And so it'll put both of our requests on the same shopping list, but it recognizes the difference between her and I for things like setting reminders. And we sound alike, her being 17 now. So sometimes I'll set a reminder, it thinks it's her, and then she'll get my reminder. So that can cause some problems. But most of the time it's pretty accurate, and it has a difficult time for me and my daughter because we're so much alike.
Do the Google Actions set the reminders or your shopping list through specific Google apps, or is it through secondary apps that are non-Google?
You can use a combination of both. So one of the hardest concepts with Google Assistant is discovery, and discovery for your actions. And I guess you call it an invocation. So order Dom Perignon is invoking the Google Assistant. but discovering actions is tricky. So for the programmer person or the person who just now got a new Google Assistant home or something, you can look in the actions directory. And that's almost, it's not an app store, because that's another issue with Google Assistant, is how do we monetize these? And really they just bring more attention to your website or apps, because there's no way to buy an action. But in the actions directory, you can find all the different published actions under category. But talking to the Google Assistant, it's one of those algorithms that Google controls. If you make an explicit, or there's implicit and explicit invocations. So explicit is when they want to talk to your actions. So I would say something like, I use the Todoist action a lot when I used to use Todoist, the app. So I say, talk to Todoist and add a task. And so then it knows which action you want to invoke, and it can pull up, it can perform that action with that specific app. But there's implicit. So if you say something like, please order me a taxi, then it's going to match that invocation with whatever app it sees best. So if you have Uber and Lyft on your phone, and those are just examples, you don't have any control so much over what it chooses.
So it's not going to ask you, there are 2 apps that I have that could do this. Do you have a preference?
No. So it just kind of fires, it will bring up which app can handle the invocation, or which one is most popular. And so that's something we can talk about. Because one of the ways to, like with app actions, that's when you build in some of these intents into your Android app. One of the ways to get recognized more by Google, and these are just in beta, is you have to report to Google through Firebase whether or not your action could successfully handle and fulfill the request, because they're more likely to recommend your app if they get positive results in that data. So by forgetting to do that, you could hurt your chances of being discovered.
So the more you basically interleave these Google core technologies, the more Google is going to pay attention to your app.
Yeah, you need to implement their APIs for reporting and do things. They have guidelines for what you should do if you want your app to be discoverable in the actions. And if you do those things, they'll get data that tells them, yes, this action is successfully fulfilling these requests, and that put you higher up in the ranking when people use an invocation. Because and also in the Google Home app, you can put shortcuts for the Google Assistant. So if there's an app that I like all the time, I can figure out a command to the Google Assistant, like talk to such and such app and do this. And I could make that be a shortcut where the invocation phrase is like, add a task. And that way, that's another way that I could like forcibly link a request I make to the assistant to a specific app or a specific action that I want with shorter verbiage, because that is tricky, is to come up with those invocation phrases as the developer and to remember them as a user. So the way I use the assistant, I've had to memorize the features that I want, and there's a learning curve. There's some practice and memorization to getting the assistant to fire up and do what I want the first time.
See, now all of a sudden I have the urge to install Assistant, Alt-Enter, give me all of the things I can look for. And no, I suppose that's...
So it does try. It does try, and you can tell it things like "I'm bored," and it'll suggest games. Or a fun one is "Scare Me," and it'll tell you jokes. And so there's a lot that comes with the assistant, like Alexa, that is built in. That's really fun. You can ask it to beatbox.
Oh, I don't.
It can beatbox. And it can sing. So a lot of times it's a good idea to ask the assistant what it can do. And another phenomenon with the assistants that I think is just hilarious. Sorry to embarrass you. But another feature another phenomenon with the assistant is I love it when there's spooky things that happen with the Google Assistant, because I've had a spooky thing happen with mine where I was randomly talking that, okay, after this, I'm going to get up and I'm going to get busy cleaning the house. And my Google Assistant lit up on the arm of my chair and said, I find that hard to believe. And for a minute, I was like, did I hallucinate that? You know, do I need to maybe check my vitamin levels or something? You know, I thought I might be going crazy.
It's like the comment where a guy and his girlfriend are in the kitchen talking, and they're like, you know what I hate in this world? All those damned transforming Decepticons. And his girlfriend laughed, and he laughed, and the toaster laughed, and he shot the toaster.
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, all the assistants, they're giving interesting personality quirks too. I know with Siri, you can say things like, open the pod bay doors, Hal. Or you can ask Siri what 5 divided by 0 is, and that will give you a series of rather interesting answers. Sometimes it will even invoke Cookie Monster.
Oh, no.
I mean, I enjoy the fact that they're all developing likable and interactable personalities. I admit I don't use it as much as I theoretically could. I know that I have a grocery list app, and I haven't even explored the Siri actions that have been out for a while, but I know that there's a lot of capability there.
That is one of the things I use the most. So I use the shopping list that comes through the Google Home app. So a lot of those base tasks are handled through Google apps and Google technology, so you don't need a third party. But there are many shopping lists. I would imagine something like Remember the Milk might have a Google action, so you can look in the actions directory and use a third party one if you want. I love the personality that the Google Assistant's getting. I'm to the point where I can barely live without it. So one of the most exciting announcements at Google I/O was that they're going to be able to take that language processing and put it local on the device in like 1.5 gigs. And that would be so cool, because if you're saying, okay, Google, please turn on my flashlight, you don't need internet for that. You just need the phone to understand it. So right now, having the phone need to be connected all the time is one of the limitations that could go away in the next generation. And it's going to be able to handle more complicated requests.
And these are things that, like I said, I haven't even thought of trying with mine. So I may have to like pick your mind and go, what else could I possibly do with an assistant? And I just have not done enough.
Yeah, so I use reminders constantly, and what's great is having an assistant in most every room in my house. I don't forget things unless I leave a Wi-Fi enabled area. And even then, I'll still get reminders, but I will be in my car where I don't really have a good way to do hands-free yet, and be like, okay, Google. And I have to unlock my phone because I don't have a Pixel. So I feel helpless without it. As the minute I have a good idea, here's a really good one. I don't know if Siri can do this. Someone at my DevFest made an action similar to this, but now it's built into the assistant. You can say, hey, Google, remember that I set my car keys on my desk, or remember that I put my electric bill in a folder, or something. And then later on, you can say, hey, Google, where did I put my electric bill?
Ooh.
And when one of my DevFest participants came up with something like that, I was like, wow, that's brilliant. And now it's really nice that that's built into the assistant. So that I use a lot. Reminders I use a lot. Asking about the weather.
I will admit that I have on occasion asked my digital assistant what the score of a sporting event is.
Yeah. And when stores are open. So that's a thing for me. And like directions are really awesome, because you can ask it, how long is it going to take me to get to this place in Denver? And it has various services. So it can tell you on the speaker Or if you ask the phone, it'll bring up like a slice that you can go straight to navigation. So it's got different capabilities on different devices. And so making these actions is challenging because you have to think the context of when are people going to use this and what device are they going to use it on? Do I want to respond to them visually, with voice, or with both? And so you have those options. Do I want to deliver web content? Do I want to bring them to a specific point in my app? So if we talk about Android app actions, that's just one facet of the Google Assistant where it allows you to deep link into your Android app. So you can say, hey, Google, I'd like to order, marshmallow graham crackers, and you have a graham cracker ordering app. It'll pull up that order in the app via a deep link. So those are going to be pretty incredible for Android developers. One of the reasons that's necessary is I have some statistics here. Is like we talked about discovery with app actions in general. Discovery of apps on your device is a problem. So like 77% of Android users stop using an app after 3 days after installing it. So that's some data gathered from 125 million mobile phones. So 3 days after they install your app, they forget it's there.
You've been busy. You collected that data from 125,000 phones?
Someone else did. So we can put a link in the show notes. But one of the things is like, why are app actions so important? Part of that is like, it's hard enough to get your action recognized, but these Android apps, those are the monetized part of our developer world. And people stop using our apps generally after 3 days. They forget it's there. And I know I have dozens of apps that I want to use, but I forget they're there. So if you could ask the assistant, I want to do a certain thing, and they could rediscover your app that way. So that could increase your user retention rate by incorporating these actions into your Android app.
That is amazing.
There is so much that the assistant can do that I can barely scratch the surface. And so app actions I've been playing with, they have a sample, which is a fitness app. So there's only 4 categories of apps right now that they're supporting actions for in beta. And that's financial, fitness, money, or I said financial already. So financial and fitness, I have a list of them over here. Transportation, and so those are, and buying things, so like a shopping app. So those are things that if you have an app in that category, you should set up your app to start supporting these actions now, so that you can test that and have your app be more discoverable via the Google Assistant.
The way the transportation apps have grown in the mobile age has been outstanding, especially with different transit organizations that are actually doing monitoring of where their transit vehicles are, so that you can say, when is the next train coming? Where is my bus going? What is the route? It's just been outstanding. And I guess, again, here I am actually phrasing it in sentences that I should be asking the assistant.
Yes, and so if you had an app, say you built a commuter app or something, to make it discoverable, you could have you could cancel a reservation, create a reservation, or get a view a reservation. If your app does any of those things, all you really have to do is put an XML file. So you you're familiar with Android development enough to know how all these little XML files. You drop in an additional XML file, you tell it which of those built-in intents that you're going to support, and you can fill in the parameters, and it's just a simple XML file that you add to your project. And then there's a few more steps beyond that, but basically it flags your app that my app handles these things. So you don't have control over the ultimate algorithm, but then when your users I need to book a taxi reservation, it might select your app and launch right into the screen where that reservation can be made. It could even take parameters like, I need a taxi at 10 a.m. So it could have that filled in on the app deep link.
For a second there, I
So,
thought you were going to give me that mystical step 2. It was like, you just need a couple of XML files and then a couple of other things.
I'll tell you what, it is a little inconvenient to test right now. So I'm wanting to write an app, maybe to track nutrition or exercise. They have a great sample for that because Nike's fitness app has these, I believe. And but you have to have an app published in the store or it doesn't have to be published, but you have to have a store listing in the Google Play console and take the app ID from that proves you own the domain. So I'm going to have to make a store listing about something and sign and upload a APK so I can have an app ID to work with for the testing. But there's a tool. What's really neat is you can test your deep links via the ADB bridge. So there's a command line command you can type in to launch your app at a certain activity and see if that works. So the testing tool I found really cool because there's a window interface comes up and it gives you that little command line command. It'll run it right then and there in Android Studio and see if your app will launch up at that particular point. So testing is interesting.
Now, you've said that this is still in beta. Is that correct?
It is in beta, and they keep saying that they're going to add more categories within a few months. And so they announced it at Google I/O 2018. But now they've, back then, I think there was only one category. Now they have the 4 categories and it's in beta. I think the projection is a couple months that there will be more categories, or maybe they'll start making it go live.
Is that, do you think that's something that will release for Q?
I hope so. Yeah, I think so. So that's my hope is that, because I would love to see more categories get entered. I have a lot of fun. I've built an action to add things to a to-do list. I've built an action for a tutorial on our site. And I would love to add app actions to an Android app. I'd like some more categories, maybe like a to-do list category. I'm a fan of to-do lists.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, what else would you like to see in this? You said the to-do list category. Are there any other categories that you really feel are missing at this point?
That's a hard question. So I couldn't think of anything. I'm sure there are, though. So they say they'll add lots. I'm sure there's a lot of categories you could add. Do you have any ideas for a category? How would you want to use a personal assistant? Because, it has to be more convenient. It has to be something that's convenient to use the assistant for that isn't already done, Well,
see, that's the thing, is that I'm a software developer. So let me get this. As a software developer, I don't typically do things like set up appointments. If I'm in a corporate world, I have people throw appointments at me and I just have to sort of go, yes, I will waste time at that appointment. What I could really use is being able to create issues in my issue tracker and saying, okay, I need to create an issue that basically is a bug saying this for the topic and this for the expected work time, because I am living in the Atlassian world of Jira and I'm doing all of that manually. And it really just slows me to a halt to have to step away from the software engineering and start working in Jira. And it would just help to say, okay, open a bug that does this, remind me to fill in the details later.
That would be a very awesome action. And if they have an API, that's one of the funnest app actions to build is you can.
Well, I know Atlassian has a huge third-party API, so you can do whatever you want with it. Maybe you can write us an Atlassian explicit
I probably could. So doing an API call in the fulfillment's pretty, it's as simple as any API call. And I'm excited with the actions. I get to rewrite my tutorial now because back in December, they were using Node.js for the backend fulfillment as the language. They had a library for that. Ticketmaster, I believe, wrote that library in Kotlin, and now Google has adopted a Kotlin version of that library. So I'm so excited that I don't have to use Node.js, and I'm looking forward to learning Kotlin to build these actions, because that was the one crux of like, well, I can limp along in JavaScript, but I'm sure not a Node.js expert. So I wish this was in a more Android-centric language like Java or Kotlin.
Suddenly I have visions of the assistant being used to help develop the assistant. It's like, hey assistant, check in class assistant version 2.0.
And I must be extra polite. I noticed the assistant evolving all the time, and one of the features that hit me a few months ago, I always say please and thank you to my assistant, and now it's like nice to you if you say please. So me and my assistant, it's always like, thanks for asking, so nice. And, so I think it's great that it responds that way, because I would hate for children in particular to think being impolite to personal assistants is okay.
See, now I'm one who said, oh, hey, Siri, go to hell.
We all get, it's easy to say things that you don't mean.
Oh, that's what I need. That's what I need. I need Siri to come back with, oh, you don't mean that. And I'm like,
Google has apologized, or the Google Assistant has kind of apologized. It's usually pretty good in those situations. Like, I'm learning all the time. I'm sorry I couldn't meet your request.
We're now using natural language to start doing crisis management.
Yeah, if you let go of a whole slew of cuss words, it tends to pick up on the fact you're frustrated.
Well, let's be honest. This is all an evolution from of all our great history, Clippy.
Yeah, ask Google if it knows Clippy, because it has something.
God, no, so horrible.
It does it. It'll tell you about its knowledge of Clippy.
Now I have to ask Siri that as well, because all this whole just translates right across.
And there's so many fun actions. I think that it might have been their t-shirt campaign or just the general excitement of the dev community. But there are a lot of creative actions out there. So you can ask it the meaning of life and all sorts of fun things. It has Star Trek and Game of Thrones and Doctor Who references. And
Yay!
I love inspiring quotes, and you can tell me something good, and it'll give you a positive news story. So that's nice.
That's nice to hear in this day and age. Jen, this is really great, and it makes me want to use my Google device, my Android device more, predominantly because I have really not spent the time using a virtual assistant. I've sort of shied away from it, but hearing the convenience of these repetitive tasks that I'm doing, it seems like a shortcut that will, well, once again, make the technology ubiquitous. And again, I will look back and go, how did I survive 25 years ago? Also, Antonio, I want to thank you for your time on this episode. It's been a real pleasure to have you. It's been some great information on clean architecture.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here too.
We are not quite done yet. We're going to come back in a moment, and we are going to wrap this season up, and we're going to talk to Jen and see what she thought of this season. We'll be back in just one moment. And welcome back to what is our rare third part of the show, which is never my favorite part, because it is with great sorrow that we say goodbye to yet another now podcastus emeritus. Jen, how did you enjoy doing season 9?
It was quite an experience. I enjoyed it a lot.
I know it was a little daunting for you at the beginning because, of course, we started this season predominantly iOS, And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, Jen, your turn to talk. And it was like, oh my God, now what?
It's interesting to present in this format. So I was definitely nervous because I've never done anything like this before.
But you've fallen into it very, very naturally.
Oh, well, thank you. I feel like I'm finally past the difficult part. So
yes,
like,
finally have the idea what to do. You're done.
yeah, that is hilarious. It's like now that I feel more confident doing it, it's all over. But it's an experience I wouldn't trade. So I think sometimes those spontaneous experiences are the best anyway, when they're unplanned and you're learning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you have a favorite episode from the season?
Well, there were many that I enjoyed a lot. I really had fun with Erica Sadu on that was one of the first episodes we did, and that blew my mind. I really enjoyed talking to John Sundell. And then with Android developers, it would be hard to pick a favorite. I would say Hadi Hariri was super fun to talk to. We had Rob Yugi. So they're all my favorite.
We had Chuki on.
Oh, yes. Chuki, she could be my favorite for sure.
I really enjoyed the episode with Sean Allen because it was a chance to talk about not just engineering, but how you actually put this kind of stuff together, the talks, the presentations, the blogs, going to conferences, and putting yourself out there. I think one of my favorite comments this season came from him. It's like, well, why did you get into this? And he said, well, out of spite. When he was talking about getting turned down at an interview, and he said, I want to prove myself, so I'm just going to put myself out there. And I think that was great. And I think it was also one of our best received shows of the season.
He's extremely inspiring because I teach adults at community college. So I get some adults that are doing career changes in their 30s and 40s. And they often ask me, is this realistic for someone to learn this skill at this age? And I tell people it's realistic any age you want to learn it. So I love that he's proof of that concept.
Oh yeah, I was actually rather amused because I had my notes for each of our speakers in a spreadsheet, and for Sean, I had the comment bearded podcaster, and he shaved. He went and shaved the beard off, and I'm like, well, but that's his logo, man. That's.
I thought you were the bearded podcaster.
But his logo actually was like braces that turned into a beard, and I love that thing. I have to admit, one of my favorite things this season was listening to Android stuff from you, because you were familiar with the app that I've been writing, and you were able to, without pandering to iOS, talk about a lot of these Android concepts in a way that I could understand. And I really appreciate that. And I know a lot of newer developers get a chance to really get a bird's eye view and a closer view at some of these Android technologies. And I really, this is our first season that we've really pushed hard on Android, and I think we did a fairly good job. And I think a lot of the credit belongs to you on that.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
So let's see. So we got some of the shows you enjoyed. We know that you've given us a lot of material. What do you think we can do better on the show?
I think it works out pretty good. So I would, let's see, what could we do better? Oh, I have an idea. This is a random idea. I think it might be fun to develop like the personality of the hosts, and maybe have a segment. Like, maybe the host could pick a segment of, like, for me, I would pick, hey, zany app actions, or, new app action of the week, funny app action, and I can make the assistant do something weird for just a few seconds or a few minutes, or, some sort of themed thing, like maybe a funny hat every week, or, but other than that, I think the format works pretty good. And it would be a lot like, I would want to learn a lot more material to give a presentation every 2 weeks. So, but a lot of people would be able to do that because they've given more talks than maybe I have.
You've raised a very good topic, and that is that we are going to need a season 10 co-host. And they obviously are going to need to have some good Android chops, because I've got my iOS stuff together, but I just cannot keep up with some of these Android things. I've learned so much, but I was coming from a place of zero. And of course, if any of our listeners or anybody watching on YouTube is interested, you email us at podcast@raywenderlich.com. But what advice as a co-host would you have for somebody who would be interested in coming in?
I would say if you're interested, to definitely do it, because it's a great platform to be heard on and to learn. So one of the best things about this experience was learning from the guests and being able to ask them questions that I'd really love to know. So that was great. And I would say to don't be upset if you're not a total expert at everything, because you could, I love the suggestion that, well, you can talk about a project you're working on and where it went wrong, or a project you'd like to do and things you'd like to know more. So pick topics that are at your level and in honesty, and you don't have to try and fake to be an expert, because we're not all experts in everything. Some people are. I'm not. So I'm always learning new stuff, and I'm catching up with some stuff, and you are where you are.
And one of our goals for the next season is to have a co-host that is not a woman with a name spelled with J. This is the third season in a row, and it's simply just worked out that way. I'm not saying we won't, but at the same time, we are looking for somebody who has got a good personality on air, on audio, on video now, a person who has some knowledge of Android, can talk about different topics. We are going to have next season a look at a whole bunch of technologies, because with Google I/O now out of the way and WWDC out of the way, we're going to be coming back around January with a lot of these topics that were dumped on us in beta and will now be coming into full release. So we'll want to really focus on things like the Google Assistant, like some of the natural language processing, some of the machine learning that's going on in the Android world. We're definitely going to be taking a look at Combine.
What about Flutter?
And Flutter, we're definitely going to see if we can talk about Flutter. We're going to talk about Combine and Swift UI and the Catalyst project, and a lot of these books that are going to be coming out relatively soon from Wenderlich.com. I know a whole bunch of books just came out in a huge Android dump.
Yep, I was an author on saving data in Android, so I'm super excited about that.
So definitely continue to check out the Ray Wenderlich site. And if you are interested, again, email us at podcast@raywenderlich.com. We do, of course, want to end this season again by thanking Triple Byte. We've thrown in that's Byte, B-Y-T-E, so many times that I think both Jen and I do that. Sometimes at parties we'll say, oh yeah, I advertise Triple Byte, that's Byte, B-Y-T-E. But they've been a great sponsor for us this season, and we really appreciate their patronage. But we will be taking a break for a few weeks, getting everything together for next season, getting a new podcast host. And we will see you back here in January. We thank you all for listening. In the meantime, I hear music playing in my own head right now, but in editing once it's done in post. That means we head back to the Emerald Castle. And Ray, take us home.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.